Podcast Junkies, episode 363. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran, podcasting since 2014 with this very show. If you're new to the show, it's the one where we search out interesting voices in podcasting, get them to kick back their heels and talk about their shows and whatever else is on their mind. And if you are a return listener, I appreciate everything you do to support the show. In case you missed last week's show, we had a really high vibe conversation with Kelly Sparta, host of the Spirit Guide and Spirit Sherpa podcast, and she shared her journey from real estate podcasting in 2005 to become a spiritual teacher and a guide. We discussed her experiences growing up with a mother who recognized her psychic abilities early on and how that shaped her path. Kelly offers insights into the challenges of finding accurate spiritual information in today's world and the importance of understanding one's core essence as a spiritual teacher. For those of you that know that I've been on the spiritual path for 20 plus years, it's something that resonated with me. This week, it speaks to another side of my brain. I have a great conversation with Eytan Bensoussan. He's the CEO of NorthOne Bank, and it's the bank that I use in my business. He also happens to be the host of This Week in Small Business, and I decided on a whim to reach out to him and see if he'd be willing to have a conversation on the show, and thankfully for everyone listening today, he decided to say yes. He shares his path from a science student to a FinTech innovator. With a background in management consulting and a family history of small business ownership, Eytan brings a unique perspective to the world of business banking. He reveals how NorthOne was born from a desire to solve the financial pain points of small business owners, and he discusses the importance of rigorous thinking, resilience in the face of challenges, and the power of customer-driven innovation. The conversation also touched on Eytan's experiences as a podcast host, the value of empathy and leadership, and the constant drive to improve and anticipate customers' needs. Eytan's insights offer a masterclass in entrepreneurship and the evolution of financial tech. As I've been doing lately, I'd like to highlight 5 important takeaways that I want you to listen out for in this conversation. Number 1, speak to customers regularly. Eytan tries to talk to 1 to 2 customers per week minimum to understand their needs and pain points, and this direct feedback informs product development and business strategy. 2, identify your MIT, or most important thing, and regularly assess where the biggest bottleneck is in your business, and focus your energy there until it's resolved before moving on to the next priority. 3rd, challenge your own thinking. Eytan encourages disagreement and different perspectives to refine ideas, and he enters conversations with strong opinions, but hopes others will trash them to reveal better solutions. I love that. 4, build resilience through experience. Facing and overcoming repeated challenge builds confidence in your ability to handle future obstacles. You should view setbacks as opportunities to develop this critical skill. And the 5th gem was to right-size your banking for cost savings. Many businesses waste money on unnecessary fees or suboptimal account structures. Regularly review your banking setup to ensure it aligns with your needs and minimizes costs. I can't wait to dive in and have you listen for these 5 gems in this conversation. Remember, if you're enjoying this episode or past episodes, or any of my past episodes, I'd love it if you leave a rating and a review at podcastjunkies.com/love. I'd love to read yours out next. These episodes are going to be chock full of great takeaways, as always. And as a listener, I want you to focus all your energy on our conversation. Rest assured, you can always visit podcastjunkies.com to read the full show notes for each episode, which includes guest links as well. Plus, as an added bonus and another reminder to connect with me, I've updated the email sign-in form on podcastjunkies.com. I just migrated to a new email platform, and there have been people that have been signing up to that email list, but haven't been receiving any updates from me, so my apologies for that. And if you want to be notified as soon as an episode goes live, please drop your email there, and I'd be happy to connect with you and get to know a little bit more about you. All right, enough about me. Before we jump into this uninterrupted conversation with Eytan, a few words from the amazing partners that support this show. Eytan Bensoussan, CEO of NorthOne and the host of This Week in Small Business. Thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get a location check. Where's home for you?
Toronto, Canada. Yeah.
How long you been there?
Born and raised in Montreal, so an even colder part of the country, and then have been there for about 5 years now.
Okay. What's something most people, don't realize, or the hidden gems of Toronto?
It's actually an enormous metropolis. I think people don't actually realize that there's it's bordering something like 10 million people when you take the surrounding regions. It's just enormous. And so that just leads you into a whole bunch of exciting and interesting things going on in many places at once. So you don't really have a shortage of things to do or things to see, which I thought was, just really fascinating.
So I took a look, obviously, at your background, and I'm a current customer of NorthOne, and I think that's how we connected. I'm a big fan of the site, so we can talk a little bit about the founding there. But I was interested that when I look back and, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at your LinkedIn in a while, but you go all the way back as a intern at the Planet Finance. So I'm curious, like, if you go back, if you think about yourself growing up, getting into school, were you always interested in finance?
No, actually, it was finance was, to be like totally honest, finance, banking, I kind of deliberately avoided them for a long time. It was far more of the challenge of things that was like getting me into them and how
Okay.
much I could learn about them rather than the financial aspect.
Mm.
And I think I then was able to remove that like mental block I had on like thinking about banking and finance. And it actually was this kind of 1 + 1 = 3. I was able to actually lean into it and say, okay, I can enter this space in a way that's comfortable for me. Whereas I think prior to that, I've seen friends go into banking, people who are going, and that
Sure.
was never the world that I wanted.
Sounds like there's a innate sense of curiosity about how things work. Is that accurate? And is that something you can trace back to your childhood?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a combination of, so for sure, curiosity, but it's also really, really attracted to what doesn't look possible, right? Like, how could I ever do this? And it's like a moth flying to the fire, right? There's like good versions of it, but then just very
Yeah.
bad versions of it. But that's something that I consistently had tracking over the course of my life.
If I had a conversation with your parents about how you were as a child, would some of that track as well?
Absolutely. I
Yeah.
mean, I made it my life's mission from basically felt like 6 years old to maybe 12 or 13 to become a baseball player.
Oh,
And I knew the odds of it, but I was just obsessed with it. And so I would be like in the morning throwing, tennis balls against the garage door, waking up the neighbors, just like kind of do drills, at night. I'd like try to like, flex my muscles in my arm, thinking if you could get away from me, throw like everything I could do obsessively until I like really got the clear signal that was not going to happen. But yeah, that was tracking a lot.
what's your earliest memory of thoughts of, or maybe experiencing anything that would we could call entrepreneurial?
I think it honestly emerged really naturally. I never even thought of it as entrepreneurialism or entrepreneurship. As early as high school, some subjects came really easy to me, like really easy, just
Yeah.
get very gratefully, right? Like things like
Yeah.
math and science. And I could tell that they were like the opposite for other people. And so it just got me very quickly into tutoring. And so I started by just saying someone's going to pay me like $20 an hour to tell them about the periodic tables or help them with like, you know, geometry. And so then
Yeah.
I started going from there, and then I created group tutorials where I would get,
Hmm.
15 people in a room, each one of them paying $100 for a
Wow.
3-hour crash course before exam period. And it was so like not effortless, but it was just such a like, of course, like people value this when I find a way to make money. And then it kind of just grew. And at one point I had started a system where I would tell my students that anyone you refer me, I will give you 10% of what I make off them in perpetuity. And so here I
Okay.
was at like a little spreadsheet, I'm like in borderline, like leaving high school, and I'm bicycling around the city, giving like little, here's $6 for, last week's,
Oh, wow.
residuals, etc. But I remember making like $3,000 or $4,000 one month just through the tutoring
Wow.
because it just grew so quickly. And again, I didn't even think of that as being a business until much later. As I got into like college, I was like, oh man, I was like building something there.
It's easier to look back at these things, because they say hindsight is 2020. But when you look at those experiences, was there anyone in your life at that time that was inspiring you?
Yeah, 100%. So I kind of had two sides of the coin. On one hand, both of my grandfathers were business owners. And so you always heard like the stories of their business owners, and they were just small business owners, nothing, we're not talking conglomerates, you know, but you kind of had all this kind of percolating in the background. And my father is in many ways like the Honey I Shrunk the Kids dad, who was always tinkering with inventions, turning them into companies.
Okay.
And so you kind of had this medium where there was always this idea of like, well, that sounds like it's never been invented before. Why don't you try to invent it? Also, this idea of, my grandpa would wake up 4 o'clock in the morning, start his day. So you kind of had both of those role models emerging at the same time, which kind of sparkled itself for me.
So there was some models to follow and some people that were inspiring you and behavior to mimic and also traits to mimic as well.
Totally. I mean, and by the way, it wasn't just the positive. Like we saw the dark side of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
My dad is an engineer by training, and the idea of the business side of his businesses was, this is a guy who could solve quadratic equations in his sleep. But then when it comes to the ledger, like you could see, like he was really like, okay, I have to go back to basics. Like, how do I make sure that, I count for every penny? I could see how tough it was in those places, which is, some of the inspiration ultimately for NorthOne, but even just
Yeah.
the idea that a business owner kind of has to do the hard things.
Yeah. I'd love to see how all these threads tie together. And something that I saw that you did early on also was you were a research intern for the Charlie Rose show.
Yeah.
I can see now how the early days coming to fruition for you, this curiosity, this entrepreneurship, this proclivity towards, the subjects like math, but the broadcasting. And also, I think you had a web series as well at Globe and Mail. So there's something there brewing about whether it's something you've learned while working with Charlie Rose show. So I'm curious about how that was starting to sprout as well.
So, as I got into college, I was just kind of honestly information overload by subjects I had never even touched before. And I started falling in love with like things like philosophy and poli-sci and being able to study business. And it was just like, how did I never know about these things that you could actually study? And so something like Charlie Rose, I would watch Charlie Rose since I was a kid with my dad late at night. And then I realized that actually the things that I'm starting to pick up outside of science are the things that they're talking about. And so I just decided, you know what? I want to try to figure out how can I work there? Can I test out this hypothesis that maybe that's my career? And I applied, I think, 3 times in a row, and I got rejected. I applied the first time, I got rejected. And I asked him, like, can you help me understand why? Like, well, you're like a science student. You're studying like biochem and math. Like, it doesn't make sense for a show which
Sure.
is on the humanities and on business. And so I said, well,
Yeah.
what would I have to do? Like, show us that you're interested in media. So I went out over that next year and I went to join the local TV station at the university. I started getting involved in the debating team and I applied again. And I said, look, you got that, but your coursework is so heavily focused in science. So
Yeah.
I declared a poli-sci minor and I did a minor in business. And finally, like I think the third year there, they said, you know what, if you're willing to come down, we'll interview you. I just got on a Greyhound, did an overnight, went to the YMCA to shower and went right to the interview and it worked out. So it was amazing. And it just, it showed me that I didn't want to be in show business per se, but
Yeah.
so many of the things that I was watching, the team behind the show, like a small army of incredibly bright people trying to put together this like the 60-minute show that was
Yeah.
emerging. I was like, that's so cool. That's like an army at work. And look what they produce.
What was the experience like getting to see Charlie Rose up close? Because, for folks that are interested in like interview-based shows, and then, they obviously there's people to model Terry Grosses of the world. And now
Yeah.
we have, newer people like the Tim Ferrisses and the Joe Rogans. But like early on, there wasn't a lot because you're limited about what you can see on TV. I grew up in an era where my parents would watch 60 Minutes, right? So you'd get those and you'd have that experience. Barbara Walters, maybe, probably showed my age with that one. But did you learn anything that
Yeah,
maybe in hindsight you're using now with the
totally.
podcast? Yeah.
Look, I think there are two of the things that come to mind. One was just an absolutely insane work ethic, just obsession level insanity, scrutinizing every single thing that happens in the show and how to improve. It never went away. And the second one was an almost like Wikipedia level like absorption of information. So you'd have a guest coming and it wasn't just like, who is this person? What can I talk to them about? Like Larry King is the other version of that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Larry
Yeah.
King was like, I don't know who I'm interviewing, let's see where this goes.
Yeah.
But this was like, looking through even like Library of Congress for like, what is even just not the subject matter, what's the adjacent subject matters? And then hundreds of pages of research per guest, all being internalized, and that expresses itself through, maybe a dozen or 15 questions over an hour. But because of that, all that, you could actually get to a lot of depth on the topic. And that level of obsession, I think, has really stayed with me.
And then you also had spent some time later with at the Globe and Mail.
Yeah.
Talk about that experience a little bit.
So this was, I came back from that time and I found one of my professors in school management and I was talking to him about it. And he said, I've been thinking about, just taking a management specific approach to interviewing leaders. So I just said, well, I'll do it with you. By the way, I had never done production. I had only been doing, how do we research people? How do we think about
Yeah.
who we want on the show? But I just bought, I can't remember what the name of it was, Final Cut Pro, which was back in
Oh
the
yeah.
day, like this, there was like 8 textbooks to figure out how to, and I just like, I bought it and I read the whole thing and I was like, all right, I'm ready to edit videos. And we just kind of
Wow.
just figured it out. But that way I was able to do both things. I was able to both prepare questions, which is what I had already done, but also I was able to be the one-stop shop where once he's finished with the taping, I'd take the whole thing, I'd edit it, I'd ship it off. And it was just, I just said yes before I said no.
How did that experience color how you thought about preparing for these conversations.
Honestly, it allowed me to think about a little bit of a laboratory. So, and sometimes, when we started the This Week in Small Business podcast, so what if I take a totally unprepared attitude, right? Like I want to see what that's like. And so I tried, and I felt that what was really frustrating for me was that it was leaving me too surface level. You're asking all of the specifics.
Yeah.
And then I went to the other way and I said, well, what if I researched the heck out of someone? And I found that had its own things, there's obviously the cost, but it allowed me to kind of almost have these different models and try to figure out what felt most natural. And I'll be candid, one of the most important things I realized is that I didn't want to have discussions where I was just agreeing and nodding. I actually
Yeah.
wanted to find points of disagreement. So I started creating this kind of engine in my mind where I was like, when I disagree, I actually like step it up. And that actually became some of the most interesting moments of that, when it's a healthy challenge in the discussion
Yeah.
rather than tracking of it. And I mean, again, for me, the mandate of the podcast was not, can we explore the life of? Because there's a different narrative approach you want to take for that. For me, it was, what are the greatest tools, tips, tricks that the best practitioners can teach the wider small business world? So I almost wanted to unpacking. Well, hang on, that doesn't make sense to me. How does that work? Why would you do this? Why don't you do that? And it's through a little bit of that, full court press that you actually get these really amazing moments of clarity or insight through the interview. Where like, oh, that's the reason why you're telling everybody they should kind of follow this methodology for managing their money, or, how they hire this way or that way. And so allow me to get to the root cause.
Is that something, it sounds like it's something you had a curiosity about early on as you started to expand what you were studying, right? Because you had, it took you 3 rounds of applying to Charlie Rose and going back and forth and realizing how much you needed to diversify the breadth of what you were learning. You mentioned something specifically about this ability to disagree with someone and push on that subject. And I think it's something that's getting lost nowadays. People are so worried about saying the wrong thing and getting canceled, and,
Yeah.
they don't want to have tough conversations. And I think what we've lost is the ability to have conversations with people who you may not necessarily agree with, but you can respect their opinions and you can have a healthy debate about it. Is this aspect of being able to, maybe debate's not the right word, but just have a longer form conversation where you can find points where you might disagree, but at the end of the day, you at least understand where they're coming from?
I think that, I mean, two things. One, I think it's just so much more interesting that way, right? It
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
who wants to be on a roller coaster where it's like a straight line to the other side? You like the loops, you like to have a little bit of the curveball in it. Everybody, the goal is not to create some sort of gotcha situation, right? If everybody knows, hey, rules of the game, we're not going to agree on everything, and that's a feature of the discussion. By the way, I
Sure.
don't even think that's just a media thing. I think, even internally at NorthOne, at the company, always start, some of our more important problem solving sessions. I feel like we assume good intent. Nothing here is
Yeah.
personal. It's not meant to be. So if you can interpret it that way, don't. And then it's about like, now you need to like rip this idea apart. And I've typically like come with a strong point of view on something, but the whole point is that I want my thinking to be reshaped. In fact, the most valuable thing for me is when I realize I'm wrong on something. Like when you're right, like great, that's
Yeah.
where I was this morning. But if I can
Yeah.
get a different perspective, man, it's so much more empowering.
Yeah. As you started realizing and playing in this world and looking at all the things that were of interest to you, you then made the move to McKinsey, which is obviously it's got a rich history of, developing folks for leadership positions. What made you lean towards that and realize that was going to be the next necessary step for you?
Yeah, well, I guess it comes back a little bit earlier than that. So after I finished studying science, I really didn't know, like, how do you get to where you want to go in life? Like, I knew I didn't want to be in a lab. It just wasn't going to be.
Yeah.
I always talk about, this is going to date me, but I always talk about, how do you become Michael Jordan on the basketball court, not Michael Jordan on the baseball field? Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, I was like, that's not my basketball court. And so all these things, and I ended up going to do a law. And I can't totally understand how I got there, but I did. And I just remembered at, the beginning of my first year of law school, I went from doing really well in science in undergrad. And here I am with letters. I didn't know they went that low. Like I'd never seen marks that terrible in my life. And I'm
Wow.
having this like, what did I do to myself here? Like, wow, this is clearly not a basketball court. This is worse. But I remember really wanting to leave and thinking like I must have made a mistake. And as I was getting ready to say, you know what, I'm just going to stop this, I realized that I hate quitting more than I hate suffering. And
Why is that?
I just was like, you know what? This is the system telling me I don't work. I'm going to like crush the system, like manage myself through it so like I can walk away from it on my
Yeah.
terms rather than simply having had the system give me low marks and tells me, hey, you're not good. No, no, I'm like, I'm good. I'm going to now find a
Yeah.
way to show this system I'm good, and I'm going to take a hike if that's where I want to go. And so
Yeah.
I actually decided to like double, triple down, and I finished law school really well. Like I did, and by the way, it doesn't come easy to me at all. I sacrificed a
Yeah.
whole lot of social, and extracurricular to just probably catch up to where the better students were, but I had to put in a lot of effort. But by having finished strong, I came to two realizations. One, nothing necessarily has to block you. But two,
Mm.
I probably am not well suited for law. And I could see my classmates who would come alive when they were in, the real
In their
legal,
zone.
yeah, in their
Yeah.
zone. I'm like, I appreciate it so deeply and I value it, but I know that's not for me. And so in many ways, going off into McKinsey was such a great combination of saying, look, I need to weaponize all this knowledge I've learned to something productive for myself. I'm kind of in so many places. And so this was almost like, taking applied human engineering. How do we solve the toughest problems? And there are no rules to the game. You kind of like use every data point, every argument, every kind of lever you can to really come to the crux of how to solve a real human problem, which is, businesses, organization. And that was a playground for me where it was exactly the right thing to kind of apply all of this horsepower I was building up over the years, but just didn't know how to like, where's the outlet for it?
Yeah. What would you say in your time there were some of the traits you acquired that you see now are helpful for you
Yeah.
to get to where you are now?
The first one was, it is not a new trait, but rather it just put a label, like just work your face off. I always was a really hard worker, but here it was
Yeah.
like taking that and saying, how do you 10, 20x that? Like do whatever it takes to solve the problem, to help the client. Like nothing
Yeah.
gets in the way of that. Not time zones, not jet lag, not like, it doesn't matter. And I
Yeah.
loved that idea of just like, you just leave everything on the field to get to the best answer for your client. And so when it comes to, business, it was just like, well, if we do whatever, in our particular situation, what does it take to make the customer happy? What does it take to get them
Yeah.
what they need? We figure it out. That we should almost like think, what's the right answer and how do we reverse engineer from that? Even if it's painful for us, even if it's that,
Hmm.
but even more importantly, it allows you to like create this very clear environment in the company saying, we need to get to the right answer on something, worries, emotions, politics, time aside, what is the right answer, in first principles, and how do we swarm to get it done and break our own rules and, not from break our own mental models. I mean, like how do you like, oh,
Yeah.
we never done it. Oh, now let's do it this way. Let's try it. And let's like, I want to be careful. Do not ever break banks. We'll see. That's not the rule I meant. But I think that was one. I think the second one was rigor, right? The putting this microscope, we call it squishy thinking. So it's like, okay, well, we're all saying, hey, this should be, about that big. What does this mean? How do we actually be
Yeah.
precise? How do we stress test? Like, okay, we have to go build this new feature for our customers. Well, what are all the assumptions we've made? Where's the greatest risk? The riskiest assumption that we actually don't have coverage on. We just kind of said, I hope this is true so that the whole thing follows. And said, we have just not standing for this does not pass the sniff test of like being a rigorous, methodical approach. And especially when I entered, the world of company building, people come from all walks of life. There's no sort of school of company
Yeah.
building,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's just, and so you would see that at least what I was helpful for me was I could really track my thinking. And it's like I had real conviction in the ideas that were coming up and they have staying power. And it was something that I saw like a lot of people had to acquire the hard way. They would kind of just, make decisions, but didn't have that instinct. Like, how do I stress test them? How do
Mm.
I de-risk the decision before throwing resources at
Yeah.
it? And that's been real valuable. I think the last one, just to kind of cap it off, is this idea of, just getting smart on a subject. You're about to, as an example, when NorthOne started, we couldn't afford stuff. I took a graphic design class from 4 to 7 a.m. for months to learn how to create
Yeah.
wireframes and how to design so I could kind of take this idea from my mind and put into something real. And then we got someone eventually who could turn that into a real product that, people want to use. But every time it was like going so deep on a subject and then resurfacing and saying, okay, now that I kind of feel I've gotten real depth here, how do I attack the problem? And this need to just not stay surface level is a big driver.
Yeah, it sounds like being in that environment, McKinsey, it's almost like you were playing in the major leagues of like business thinking. I think of the Jim Rohn quote, you are the average of the five people you spend the most time with. And like,
Right.
I
Yes.
imagine there was a lot of that. Like everyone's like moving aggressively and thinking, and you're looking left and right, and everyone's just kind of like operating at that same level as well.
Yeah. And you know what? I also learned there, and this was not intuitive, that doesn't have to, that can be also complemented with kindness.
Yeah.
I met some of the smartest, like hardest charging people I've ever met in my life. And yet so many of them were so deep, were kind and warm and thoughtful. And it was almost like, in the movies you get, or TV, like you get this, like imagine where like the more successful the business person is, the more of a jerk they're going to
Yeah.
be and we
Yeah.
could care less. And I'm sure that's true. There's plenty of, but I actually found that there were people who marry being deeply human
Mm,
and empathetic and kind with being incredibly hard charging and fast working. And being able to realize that that zero sum is more of a mental model for movies because
yeah.
it's easy for us to kind of think of that stereotype, but the real elegance is when people just marry to both in real life.
I know from a business perspective, it makes a lot of sense nowadays. And back then, you think about the Rockefellers and Carnegies, they're just like go, 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 and at all costs. But has this always been something that's important for you, this idea of like having empathy, caring for your fellow human in the context of, building and growing a business?
Yeah, I don't know that I have given it that name. Like
Yeah.
I didn't like spending time around jerks, right? We now label that as like saying, oh, you're looking for X, Y, and Z in the environment. Sure. But I mean, ultimately, like I just wanted to spend time around people that I liked. And that
Yeah.
probably
Makes sense.
solved for some of those things. I think this amazing, one of my best friends, she's a doctor now, and she once taught me the difference between compassion and empathy. And that's when everything clicked for me.
Mm,
In med school, they talk to you about this idea of empathy, which is where you put yourself in the shoes of the person who will be feeling this and you let you feel like they
yeah.
will. And there's compassion, which is where you can kind of understand what the person will be feeling and have compassion for them, but it doesn't change what you got to do.
Mm,
And so the way they work,
yeah.
they teach them that the difference is this idea where, let's just say you have to tell someone that their child has passed, right? If you try
Yeah.
to have empathy, you put yourself in the shoe of that parent, you're frozen. How could anybody, like,
Of
it just
course.
erects you. But when you have compassion, it's about being able to, look, how they're going to feel and it's going to be terrible. But you do have to kind of walk them into the room, help them understand what's going on, talk to them about like next steps because they're going to be, in that state of total loss.
Yeah.
And those two, that was one of the biggest gifts that she gave me. When I understood that, it allowed me to kind of understand that, especially at work when it's live or die by your results. And so
Yeah.
being able to have compassion for the people around you, but it doesn't change that, like, we still got to get this done and come hell or high water. And so you
Yeah.
say, like,
Yeah.
I understand how bad that's going to be. And I understand how painful this might be, especially when you're giving, critical feedback, but it doesn't change the fact that the facts are the facts. They don't care about our feelings. So as humans, we can kind of appreciate that and we won't argue with the facts, but we can then at least understand what this will do to other people emotionally.
Yeah. I love the distinction. Thanks for sharing that. So talk to me about the origin story of NorthOne.
So it kind of merges two parts of my life. I
Yeah.
grew up in a family of small business owners. And so I just saw, I mean, I hinted at it, but I saw how people who are really good at something, my grandfather was an electrical contractor, right? So he would kind of small team and would go run the wiring through a whole bunch of malls and homes. He was really good at that. You could sleep easily knowing that the wiring in your house is done well. But was he like incredible at keeping his receipts, at knowing how the books were going to close by the end of the month? Not necessarily, right? And so
Yeah.
the superhuman level of retention he had to put that was incredibly draining, but it would become his weakest link if he didn't get it done well. Same thing with my dad.
Yeah.
And so I just grew up knowing that there was almost this like two-sided beast to entrepreneurship. You're killing it on the basketball court, doing the thing that you're selling, but then you're going to play baseball where you have to deal with all these things. Sometimes it could be HR for people, it could be
Yeah.
finance. There's a whole bunch of things which come with the package. And so that was just this one context. And the second one was I spent, in my time at McKinsey, we spent a lot of time working with a lot of these large companies and organizations who are just spending too much running their finance department. And they said, how do we
Mm,
actually, we don't want to sacrifice the quality or the output, but it can't be that it costs us 50 million a year to run finance on a global level. And so having done many of those, I started realizing that these companies were able over time to save many dozens of millions of dollars each on this by doing a couple things. One, right sizing their bank accounts. A lot of them had just gotten bank accounts as time went on. And, you'd have a company making billions of dollars that had hundreds of bank accounts, which had hundred transaction limits. And every
Mm.
overage is another $2. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
you don't realize this because, it's such a little corner of the business sometimes, but we realize that you could just, if you right size your bank account, there's so much savings to be had. And that's kind of the first step for NorthOne, which is so many of the small businesses out there, they're just using bank accounts that are, charging them fees that, they could
yeah.
avoid, that are not giving them the best possible return on their money through interest, through cash back. And so when we started NorthOne, I said, I want to make it this the place where any small business in America, this is the right size bank account for me. There's no fees, free inbound wires, APY, cashback, all the things that you want. Problem one. Problem two that, I saw these big companies solving was they were starting to connect all the information across their various tools. In a big enterprise context, that's like, oh, the East Coast accounting system or the West Coast accounting system, and how do we kind of, but in a small business, you're thinking even like receivables, payables, your
Sure.
balances, these are things that typically live in silos until maybe the end of the month or quarter when you're like, does it all net out? The ability to start giving people an ability to connect the dots on the information on all the money coming in, coming out, what are some of the insights that emerge, how you kind of track the big picture. And finally, how do you kind of, where you can automate the processes? In a large company setting, it means you have a team of 75 people doing manual entry, for example. And
Yeah.
sure, it gets it done, but it can be wasteful. If you could have a product that does that. In the life of a small business owner, it's like Post-it notes. How many Post-it notes? Like on the 15th of the month, it says I got to go check this. And how do we get those Post-it notes off their desks and just have
Yeah.
it delivered in the product experience? I'll give you like one little example to bring it to life. In NorthOne, one of the things that is one of our most successful features is our envelope system, where people can kind of take
Yep.
the balance and just carve it out into small allocations. It just helps them, typically a balance is like a giant mountain of money. And I'm like, I don't know what part of this is about to get shipped off for tax and what part I have to reserve for rent. And so creating a budget inside of your bank account was one way to remove that kind of burden of like, we have so many people that have just used that. And, I used to intermittently try to update things in Excel or Google Sheets, but I'm not good at doing it every day. And it was like
Yeah.
I'd have to like do it late at night. Now they're just like reallocating, just dragging in real time, like how much money should go into which envelope. And it just gives you a little bit of that visibility into the business. And then we started, for example, building on that and sending people a daily or a weekly recap of their bank account saying, how'd you do month over month? How'd you do week over week? And what are the biggest things that have shifted your balance? Just those things answered what we have found were some of the 5 most common questions customers would ask themselves when we asked them, like, what do you often? And we were able to give that back to them. So this is an example of how we tried to bring that mandate to life for small business, Camry, because there's an army of companies trying to serve the largest companies in the world. And they're building custom, but very few people are building software bespoke for small businesses in a way that actually is not a stripped down version of what was an enterprise solution. And we're just going to like create the cheap version. How do you actually create by intentionally the world-class solution for a small business owner? That's your goal, not something else adjacent. You kind of slide down into that place. And that's kind of where that comes together.
Yeah, and that idea of the envelopes was popularized with Michael McCallitz's Profit First book, and I
100%.
think
So
yeah.
when I was in college, I read Profit First and created a very unsuccessful business with it, but the system stuck, right? And I was like, and that's why when we launched, the one thing that I was adamant, like we cannot launch without envelopes because I know people who use Profit First are going to want to use envelopes. And so we've got to kind of be able to offer this. And candidly, in retrospect, that was a good call because it's been one of the things which has helped our customers a lot. And now we're actually investing heavily in what's envelopes V2? How do we bring these things? And it just, you talk to a lot of customers, you realize the creative ways people are using this in ways I wouldn't even have imagined. And how can we kind of make that easier?
Yeah, that's one of the features that I looked for when I was looking for a bank, and that's why
Nice.
NorthOne popped up. Yeah. So how does one, again, hindsight 2020, how does one think about starting like big picture, like starting an online bank is no easy feat. Like it's not something you can do. It's not like whipping up like a simple SaaS product or like a
Yeah.
website. There's a lot involved. And so talk a little bit about what you maybe wish you knew when you first started that you
Yeah.
know now. We're about 8 years in.
I didn't know what it was going to be when I started. I started with knowing a problem that was like, this is so silly that no one has solved this. It was just simply the insanity that a small business has to go through just to manage their finances and
Yeah.
it was just crazy. And so I started saying, like, how do I explore that? I spoke to 100 small business owners before I even started the company and
Yeah.
just said, like, what keeps you up at night? I had like an interview script that I would go through, and it led me to a couple of real peaceful moments of mental clarity. Because when I started, I thought maybe it's going to be like a cool dashboard that I can build in or some sort of
Yeah.
plug-in, because that was realistic for me, right? That was like something I
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
chew on. But then when I came to it, the intellectually honest answer was that they were saying, look, I don't need another tool. Like the last thing I want to deal with is another thing I got to log into, another tool to
Yeah.
like, but every one of them was saying, but the pain starts with the money. It's,
Mm.
do I have enough? I'm like, why am I getting dinged for all these fees? I can't even like end an instruction manual to operate my bank account. And I need like quick answers there. I don't need like, and so to me, the intellectually honest answer was to say the bank account until recent days has been kind of like a power socket, right? What do you
Yeah.
expect out of your power socket? Just plug the thing in and it works. People often like a bank account, it's only plug in and it works, but really that's actually the best place, if you think about it, where with all of your finance operations should be stemming from there.
Yeah.
And so it was about thinking, what if your bank account and your banking platform, of course, they would give you the best banking experience, but what if that was the starting point for a whole bunch of other things that your business will need? For example,
Yeah.
paying automatic bill payment, budgeting, and revenue analytics, all things that we've over time have built into NorthOne because it was the next step in how to help customers. And I'll just kind of go back for a sec. It never takes away to actually convince someone that you earn their business. You have to have the best product that they're looking for. So what I mean by
Yeah.
that is on its merit, the bank account has to be the best possible bank account that it can be. It's not because I have an extra tool you weren't looking for necessarily that you're going to now choose me. You have to be able to win on the merits of being the best customer service you can get,
Of course. Yeah.
fastest money movement, biggest limits, etc., better fee structure. And then if I can then be in your consideration set of people worthy of your business, let me tell you about all these other things you weren't necessarily looking about, but oh man, can they really lighten the load? And that's that two-part process in which we found that, really resonates with business owners. Because very, candidly, I can't think of a single business owner who's looking for some sort of a bill payment solution. That, you know what? I'm going to get a bank account to go get that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's the wrong order. But we do see people who are like, I need a great bank account. And oh, that's really cool. They have all these things. How did they know this is another part of the thing that bugged me at
Yeah. Yeah.
work?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of this important insight.
How have you grown as a leader? This was your first CEO experience, right?
Yeah. I mean, tremendously. But what it does is it just shines light on who you are. I found that the more founding a company, hiring people, running it with a team, you can't reprogram yourself overnight. Like probably by the time you're 30, you're like 90% of who you're going to be, and you can kind of dial things up or down, but it just shines a light. And so that level of the thing that enabled it for me is just a self-awareness. I'm really good at this. I'm not good at that. And it helped me just stop being fuzzy about it, saying, I could probably do this. Like, no, 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 just declare bankruptcy on the things that you're bad at and just find someone better than you. So certainly like it helps you shine light. But I think the other one is just the power of resilience. Like it just, every time that you feel like everything's about to end, you realize that there is just some way that you can figure it out. And the first time that happened, to be honest, I was like, it's really going to end. Like I was like, it's all over. And this is like early days. This is like really, really early. We weren't
Yeah.
even live. I had other things that kind of like torpedoes that came my way. I was like, we're never going to get to launch and we're never going to get investors. And by the second, third, or fourth time, I'm like, you know what? I don't know how I'm going to solve this one, but I actually know what I'm going to solve it. And
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
able to have gone through enough of those like moments where you're just white and you're like in a cold sweat, but then live the next day, it kind of gives you this armor to say, you can kind of throw a whole bunch of problems at me. And yeah, I'm going to have that first minute where I feel like, my heart's in my stomach. But after that, my mind starts going and I'm like, all right,
Yeah. Yeah.
cool as a cucumber. How do we proceed? And that's, I think, the thing that I could have told you maybe intellectually years ago that was true. But this is the one where I'm like, you are going to have to live this over and over and over again for you to
Mm.
actually realize at the end of it that, resilience is maybe the most underrated skill that no one works on because so much of it just is when life happens to you.
Yeah.
But has that been valuable?
Yeah, and it's just kind of as leading to or reflecting back on the earlier experiences you've had, you learn to build that resilience over the years and learn how not to give up in the face of adversity. And I think that's clearly shown and it clearly helped you for these moments. What's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently?
What not? You're like, I'm walking in my mind. I'm like, well, there's got to be like 50 of them.
Yeah.
But tough question is how. I mean, I'll give you three kinds of questions that came through recently. One is, who do I need to be in 6 months to like, what's the company going to need out of
Yeah.
me?
I love that.
And sometimes it's not even 6 months. Sometimes it's like in the next month. Does my calendar reflect what is important, and am I spending time and et cetera? Like that is a real, I have to regularly just take a step back and say, like, where do I need to be? Because, typically when you run a company, you're actually able to go anywhere,
Yeah.
right? You can be in one moment you're in sales, then you're in HR. And so at some point they're all necessary. But then when you have this moment to say, well, where is the biggest bottleneck for the company? That's where I throw myself. And that's actually a question that has come back over and over. I call it my MIT, which is my most important
Mm.
thing. I kind of say, like, this is clearly the most important bottleneck of the company
Yeah.
right now. And I just completely throw myself in and I blow up the calendar and until we solve it. And then I move on to the next one. I think the other part is conversely, you know, are we solving, are we helpful enough
Mm.
for our customers? Like, where are we falling short? It's one thing to kind of get, oh, your NPS is doing great and customers are very satisfied, but there's just this constant little paranoia of saying, yeah, but what
Mm.
about next month? Where are we kind of slipping now that we don't see? And how do we get ahead of that? And I feel like, that's a hard question because when you have things that are working, it's such a good emotional feeling to say, I can breathe a bit. But actually, my instinct has now become when things are working well, my paranoia grows and saying, well, where is the thing? Where's like under the water?
Sure.
Where is the
Sure.
thing that's coming my way that I need to kind of prepare for?
That's very interesting. I love that, the MIT. So obviously we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the inspiration for the podcast, but I get a
Yeah.
sense that, it was bubbling based on everything we've talked about.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about why you felt like you needed one more thing on your plate.
Yeah, honestly, it came from our customers. I try to speak to maybe one or two customers a week, ideally more, but that's my minimum. And got a lot of questions from them like, hey, do you know of any good resources on how to better manage my salon? Or, my construction company is doing really well, but like I'm starting to get pulled at the edges. Like, I don't know how to like create more time for myself. And I was getting a
Yeah.
lot of these that had nothing to do with what we did as, in banking, but rather were more about how do I run a better business? And so
Yeah.
I just said, I wonder, I would actually, by the way, I would Google things and I'll put like a little email package for them together saying, here are the top 5 resources I found. Here's why I like this one. I'll try to create like a mini guide.
Sure.
And I just had this thought of like, well, what if instead of doing this one at a time, what if I could just go find some of the best practitioners in different industries and actually bring them, share that with all of our customers in those industries? So it was a lot less about what I had to say for sure,
Yeah.
and a lot more about could I be a convening factor to bring some of the sharpest business owner operators to our customers, and hopefully they could learn a little bit. And I remember like when we started that, I wouldn't say go listen to the podcast. I would try to send an email saying, here are the 5 timestamps that had really nuggets. If you're going to
Yeah.
just learn one thing, learn those. My goal wasn't to say like, can you kind of get people's eyes for 35 minutes, but
Yeah.
rather, can I have that conversation and bring a couple of nuggets that are then something I can take to the customers? And that's really kind of where it started.
What's that experience been like for you, and how have you grown as a host of the show?
Yeah, it's actually really tough to
Yeah.
switch your brain. Sometimes it even catches up on me. Like I'm just dealing with something really heavy in the morning in the team or the company. And then all of a sudden I realize like, oh shoot, in 20 minutes, I have
Oh,
to
no.
like open my mind and like,
Yeah.
bring this person in. And so that's actually one of the hardest thing, which is kind of just mental shift you got to make before and after.
Yeah.
And to be clear, like the company doesn't miss a beat. Like it doesn't give me some sort of, oh, I couldn't get this done on time. You just got to do the overtime. So that's the first one.
Yeah.
And the second one is, as a host, you just have this such a better radar for how do I make this an interesting conversation?
Mm.
How do I avoid the monologue and
Yeah.
really pull through? And sometimes you kind of go to a place that you weren't expecting, and
Yeah.
that's okay too.
Yeah. I've found it's made me a better listener. It's made me more curious and be more interested in pulling threads when I hear them. And I think it's translated to the real world. Has any aspect of running the podcast helped you in your personal life or in the business as well?
On the personal side, it has given me much better questions to talk
Mm.
to people around me. I'm much better at asking questions. I'm much better at listening to the answers and then making that as a stepping stone to the next
Mm.
really interesting thing. So my hope, people will tell me whether I'm right or not, but I hope I've become a more interesting person. And then the other part is that it's also given me a lot more patience on listening to the full answer to people even at the company. Like, avoid interrupting when it's not necessary. It's just a great, like a little bit of a control system that I can implement.
Yeah, that's awesome. So a couple of questions as we wrap up. I appreciate
Yeah.
all your time. Really, this has been a really fascinating conversation. What is something you've changed your mind about recently?
I'd say the thing that I'll widen the definition of recently a little bit,
Yeah.
but I think the thing that I found was the biggest mindset shift that I made was how to sell NorthOne, right? I used to really lead because that was the problem I grew up with, is this productivity issue, right? Like it weighs on you like this all the time, this idea of your finances in your business. And over the last year or so, I actually realized that it was actually selling the bank account on its merits as a means to being able to have the conversation about productivity. And when I made that switch, it just opened up so much for us with our customers, with the company. That was, I think, one of the most interesting insights that I think that flipped my mind on how to even think about how to articulate the value of NorthOne to a small business owner.
What has you most excited? If you think about, look up, I know it's hard to project too far in the future, but maybe 12 months from now, we're having this conversation. What's on the roadmap that you're looking forward to building?
Well, look, I mean, that's what's actually so exciting. It's the roadmap. It's the stuff that, we do a lot of listening. And we really spend time trying to ask people, like, what can we do better? What's something that you're missing? Where are other money things happening in your life as a business that are not here? And what can we learn about that? And do you need those replaced or not? Like, a lot of humility on saying, like, don't break that. That's working just fine right now. But as a result of that, the things that we then are planning on, it's just really exciting because you know that it's going to hit the string of someone that's told you, like, this is a thing I could really use. That gets me excited. And I think the other one is that as a company, I think the team is sharper now than it's ever been. When we put a lot of work into getting everybody closer and closer and closer to our customers. And so no one works in a silo of an abstract small business owner. People can know and almost feel what those owners are looking for. And that gets me really excited because candidly, the best decisions, the best ideas, they definitely don't come from me. They come from people who are like in the trenches, working on stuff. And they're like, hey, what about? And all of a sudden that turns into something very novel.
Love that. Last question. What is the most misunderstood thing about you?
That I know all the answers. Okay. I come into every conversation with a point of view very, very quickly, and I'm pretty, firm about it. But that's only because I'm almost dangling as there for meat, like for someone to come and just start trashing it. My greatest hope is that people come and show me that I'm wrong. I think people sometimes think that the fact that I have a point of view means I think I'm right, but it's really not that.
Yeah. Well, Eytan, thanks again. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we got connected. When I saw that you had a podcast and I was like a client of your service, I was like, you don't see very many CEOs who are hosting the show and who, as it's clear from this conversation, take as much of an interest in what their customers are thinking and how they want to support them. But it's clear now, as we've sort of pulled the curtain back on your origin story and how all the pieces started to lead, your influences from your family, the drive that you've had, this fire that it's been building up over the years, and how you've had this persistence and always making sure you can push through in the face of adversity. I think it's no surprise that we ended up where you're at now, and it speaks to like what you're building with NorthOne. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share this inspiring story with my listeners.
Well, thanks for your interest, Harry. I'm appreciative of the opportunity.
So obviously it's northone.com for folks to learn more about NorthOne. Anywhere else you want to send folks to get connected with you?
NorthOne.com, first one. I mean, I'm on Twitter at Eytan
Okay.
You can find me there.
Okay. All right. Well, make sure we have those links in the show notes as well. I really appreciate your time, Eytan.
Thanks. My pleasure.